The neon sign of Murphy's Tavern flickered against the rain-soaked pavement as 22-year-old Jake Sullivan pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The bass-heavy rumble of 50 Harley-Davidsons lined up outside had already announced what kind of night this would be. Inside, leather-clad bikers filled every corner of the dimly lit establishment, their voices mixing with classic rock blaring from the jukebox. Jake, still wearing his faded military surplus jacket, approached the bar with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen more than his fair share of hostile territory. What he didn't expect was Tommy "Tank" Morrison, the 6'4" bouncer with arms like tree trunks, blocking his path with a sneer that had intimidated countless patrons before. "Hold up there, kid," Tank growled, his voice cutting through the noise. "This ain't some college hangout." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake stopped 3 feet from the bar, his steel blue eyes meeting Tank's challenging stare without flinching. The conversation around them gradually died as heads turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Jake stood barely 5'10", but there was something in his posture, shoulders back, feet planted, hands relaxed at his sides, that spoke of training most people in Murphy's Tavern had never experienced. "Just looking for a beer," Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the sudden attention from 50 pairs of eyes. Tank let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "Well, this is Veterans Night, Junior. Every Tuesday, this place is reserved for real soldiers, men who actually serve their country, not wannabes playing dress-up in surplus store gear." The accusation hit the room like a match dropped into gasoline. Several bikers shifted in their seats, some nodding in approval of Tank's gatekeeping, others leaning forward with interest. These weren't just any bikers, they were members of the Rolling Thunder Motorcycle Club, a group composed entirely of military veterans who'd found brotherhood on the open road after their service ended. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd heard this challenge before, in different places, from different people. The assumptions came with his youthful appearance and quiet demeanor. At 22, he looked like he'd barely graduated high school, let alone survived multiple deployments in Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. "I can show you my DD-214, Jake offered, referring to the military discharge document that proved service. Tank waved dismissively, his massive frame blocking more of Jake's path to the bar. "Anyone can fake paperwork these days, kid. Hell, you can probably buy that stuff online. What I want to know is where you served, when you served, and with who. Real veterans know the details." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a dozen cigarettes. Jake glanced around the room, taking in the faces watching him. These men ranged from their 30s to their 70s, each bearing the invisible marks of military service. Tattoos peeked out from beneath leather jackets, unit insignias, dates of service, memorial pieces for fallen brothers. Their bikes outside weren't just transportation. They were extensions of their identities, chrome and steel symbols of the freedom they'd fought to preserve. Marcus Steele Rodriguez, the club's president and a Vietnam veteran, set down his beer and turned his full attention to the unfolding drama. At 68, Steele had seen enough young men try to claim stolen valor to last several lifetimes. His weathered face showed skepticism, but also a willingness to listen. "Kid's got a point, Tank," called out Danny Wheels Patterson, a Gulf War veteran nursing a whiskey at a corner table. "Let him prove it proper. Ask him something only a real soldier would know." Tank's eyes lit up with predatory interest. He'd played this game before, usually sending posers scurrying for the exit within minutes. "All right, Junior, let's start easy. What's the maximum effective range of an M4 carbine?" 550 meters for a point target, 600 for an area target." "Lucky guess. Any video game player knows that. How about this? What's the weight of a loaded Alice pack during a standard patrol? Jake's expression didn't change. It depends on the mission length and terrain, but typically 60 to 80 pounds, not counting water, though most units switched to MOLI systems years ago. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The answer was correct, but more importantly, Jake had added the detail about MOLI systems, something a faker pulling information from basic military websites might not know. Tank's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. What's the standard punishment for falling asleep on guard duty? Article 86 of the UCMJ, sleeping on post, could be anything from reduction in rank to confinement, depending on circumstances and command discretion. More heads were nodding now. Jake's answers weren't just correct, they carried the casual precision of someone who'd lived these realities rather than memorized them.
Steele stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. At 6'2", he commanded respect through presence rather than intimidation. "Tank, step aside. Let me handle this." Tank reluctantly moved, though his suspicious glare never left Jake's face. Steele approached slowly, studying Jake with the calculating eye of someone who'd interviewed countless soldiers under stress. "Son, those were textbook answers. Any dedicated researcher could find that information. What I want to know is something different. Tell me about the weight." Jake's composure faltered for the first time since entering Murphy's tavern. The weight? "Every soldier carries weight that isn't in any manual," Steele continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The weight that keeps you awake at 0300 hours when you're supposed to be sleeping. The weight that makes you check your six even when you're in a grocery store back home. The weight that makes simple questions like, 'How was your day?' impossible to answer honestly." The room fell completely silent. This wasn't about memorized facts or technical specifications anymore. Steele had shifted the conversation to territory that couldn't be faked or researched online. Jake stood motionless for several seconds, his young face cycling through emotions that seemed far too heavy for someone barely out of his teens. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravitas that hadn't been there moments before. "The weight of knowing that every decision you make might be the difference between your brothers coming home or not. The weight of carrying letters from guys' families that they'll never get to read. The weight of understanding that some of the people you're trying to help would rather see you dead, while some of the people you trusted with your life didn't deserve that trust." Jake paused, his gaze distant, as if seeing through the tavern's walls to some other time and place. "It's the weight of being 22 years old and having already attended more funerals than weddings. The weight of coming home to people who thank you for your service but look uncomfortable when you don't fit their idea of what a hero should look like. The weight of knowing that the hardest battles you'll ever fight won't be in some desert halfway around the world. They'll be in your own head, every single day, for the rest of your life." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the jukebox seemed to respect the moment, having ended its current song without starting another. Steele's weathered face softened as he processed Jake's words. The old Vietnam veteran had heard countless war stories over the decades, but there was something in this young man's delivery that cut through the usual bravado and posturing. The raw honesty in Jake's voice carried the unmistakable signature of authentic experience. "What unit?" Steele asked quietly, though his tone had shifted from interrogation to genuine interest. "2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, deployed to Kandahar Province 3 times between 2019 and 2022. Jake's answer came without the swagger that often accompanied such prestigious unit affiliations. If anything, he seemed reluctant to share the information. A collective intake of breath rippled through Murphy's tavern. The 75th Ranger Regiment wasn't just any Army unit. They were elite special operations soldiers, the kind of warriors who operated in the shadows of America's most dangerous conflicts. Several of the bikers exchanged knowing glances. They understood the significance of what Jake had just revealed. Bobby Gunner Martinez, a former Marine who'd lost his left leg to an IED in Fallujah, wheeled his chair closer to the bar. At 35, Gunnar had seen enough combat to recognize the real thing when it walked in the door. His suspicious expression had transformed into something approaching respect. Rangers don't usually advertise their service. Most Spec Ops guys I know would rather blend into the background than deal with the attention. Jake nodded slowly. Wasn't planning on discussing it tonight. Just wanted a quiet beer and maybe some decent food. Tank, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the dynamic in the room shifted away from his initial challenge, decided to make one more attempt at maintaining his authority. Hold on now. Rangers are supposed to be these super soldiers, right? This kid looks like he weighs maybe 160 soaking wet. You expect us to believe the Army sent someone who looks like he should be checking IDs at a movie theater into special operations? The comment sparked uncomfortable laughter from a few of the younger bikers, but the veterans who had actually seen combat weren't laughing. They knew that appearances in the military meant nothing. Some of the most dangerous soldiers they'd served alongside had been quiet, unremarkable men who could disappear into a crowd without effort. Jake turned his attention to Tank with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the encounter. Size doesn't determine lethality. The most dangerous sniper I ever worked with was a woman who weighed maybe 120. She could put a bullet through a target's eye socket from 800 meters away while lying in a muddy ditch for 18 hours straight. Meanwhile, I've seen gym rats who looked like action movie stars freeze up the first time bullets started flying in their direction. Easy to say, Tank pressed, though his voice carried less conviction than before. But talk is cheap. What makes you so special?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead of answering directly, Jake reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a small, worn photograph and placed it on the bar where everyone could see. The image showed a group of 8 soldiers in full combat gear, their faces painted with camouflage, standing in front of a military helicopter in what appeared to be a desert environment. "Operation Crimson Dawn," Jake said quietly, pointing to his younger self in the photograph. "March 15, 2021. We were tasked with infiltrating a Taliban stronghold in the mountains outside Kandahar to extract a CIA asset who'd been compromised. The intel was supposed to be solid, minimal resistance, quick in and out." Steele leaned closer to examine the photograph, his trained eye noting details that others might miss. The soldiers' equipment was top tier. Their positioning spoke of professional training, and the helicopter in the background bore markings consistent with Special Operations aviation units. "Intel was wrong," Jake continued. "What was supposed to be a straightforward extraction turned into a 14-hour firefight against over 200 Taliban fighters. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from reinforcement." Danny Wheels Patterson had moved closer to hear the story, his own memories of similar situations in Iraq causing phantom pain in his prosthetic leg. "How many of you made it out?" Jake's finger moved across the photograph, pointing to each face. "Thompson, killed by sniper fire in the first hour. Rodriguez, bled out after stepping on a pressure plate IED. Williams, took shrapnel to the neck from a mortar round. Jefferson, captured alive, tortured for 3 days before we could mount a rescue operation." The room had grown so quiet that the distant hum of the refrigerator behind the bar seemed loud. Jake's matter-of-fact delivery somehow made the tragedy more impactful than emotional theatrics would have been. "Kowalski lost both legs but survived the evacuation. Martinez, different Martinez than Gunnar here, suffered traumatic brain injury from a grenade blast. Henderson developed severe PTSD and took his own life 6 months after we got home." Jake paused, his finger resting on the final face in the photograph. "That leaves me." Steele straightened up, his expression grave. "You were the only one who came home intact." "Physically intact. But intact is a relative term. I carry pieces of all 7 of those men with me everywhere I go. Thompson's sense of humor when everything was falling apart. Rodriguez's devotion to his family back in Texas. Williams's terrible singing voice that somehow kept our spirits up during the worst moments. Jefferson's courage under torture. He never gave up our position, even when they were—" Jake's voice trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. The implications hung heavy in the air. Marcus Wrench Thompson, a Navy veteran who had been quietly observing from his barstool, suddenly stood up. At 55, Wrench was known for his mechanical skills and his ability to repair anything with an engine, but he was also known for his unwavering respect for authentic military service. "Son," Wrench said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his stripes the hard way, "you don't owe these people your war stories. Some experiences are meant to stay between brothers." Jake looked at Wrench with gratitude. "I appreciate that, sir. But sometimes sharing the weight makes it a little easier to carry." Tank, who had been growing increasingly agitated as his authority evaporated, made one final attempt to salvage his position. "This is all very touching, but how do we know any of this is true? A photograph and a sob story doesn't prove anything. For all we know, he found that picture online and memorized some military jargon." The accusation sparked immediate anger from several of the veteran bikers, but Jake raised his hand in a gesture that somehow commanded immediate silence. There was something in his bearing, a quiet authority that seemed disproportionate to his age and appearance that made everyone in Murphy's Tavern pause. "Tank," Jake said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "You're right to be skeptical. Stolen valor is a real problem, and it dishonors the memory of people who actually paid the price. But I'm going to show you something that can't be faked, bought online, or researched in any manual." Jake began rolling up the right sleeve of his military surplus jacket, revealing his forearm inch by inch. What he exposed made several of the bikers gasp audibly. Running from his wrist to his elbow was an intricate tattoo that told a story more powerful than any words could convey. The design featured 8 military dog tags arranged in a vertical line, each bearing a name, rank, and date: Thompson, Rodriguez, Williams, Jefferson, Kowalski, Martinez, Henderson, and at the bottom, his own. But Jake's tag was different. Where the others showed death dates, his showed only a question mark. Interwoven between the dog tags was a detailed rendering of a mountain landscape that could only have come from personal experience. The peaks, valleys, and rock formations were rendered with the precision of someone who'd spent days studying every ridge and shadow while fighting for his life. Along the bottom of the tattoo, in small but clearly legible script, were GPS coordinates: 31.6180 degrees north, 65.7150 degrees east, the exact location of Operation Crimson Dawn. But it was the final element of the tattoo that brought complete silence to Murphy's Tavern. Wrapped around Jake's wrist like a bracelet was a series of small hash marks, exactly 237 of them. Each mark represented a confirmed enemy kill during that 14-hour firefight. Steele, who had seen more combat than most men could imagine, found himself struggling for words. The level of detail, the personal significance, the raw emotional weight of what Jake had permanently etched into his skin, it all spoke to an authenticity that simply could not be fabricated. "Dear God, son," Steele whispered, "you killed 237 enemy fighters in one engagement?" Jake carefully rolled his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo. "I did what was necessary to keep my brothers alive for as long as possible. When you're outnumbered 40-1 and completely surrounded, rules of engagement become very simple. You kill them before they kill you." The revelation of Jake's tattoo had fundamentally shifted the atmosphere in Murphy's Tavern, but Tank wasn't ready to concede defeat. His reputation as the establishment's ultimate gatekeeper was crumbling, and desperation was making him increasingly aggressive. He stepped closer to Jake, his massive frame casting a shadow over the younger man. "All right, so you've got some ink and a story," Tank sneered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier.
but any decent tattoo artist could create something like that if you paid them enough. What I want to see is how you handle yourself when things get physical." The suggestion sent ripples of tension through the room. Several of the veteran bikers exchanged concerned glances. They'd witnessed Tank's challenges before, and they knew the bouncer's physical capabilities were legitimately intimidating. At nearly 300 pounds of muscle and standing 6'4", Tank had never lost a confrontation at Murphy's Tavern. Jake remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "I didn't come here to fight anyone." "Course you didn't," Tank laughed harshly, "because you know you can't back up all that tough guy talk. Rangers are supposed to be fighters, right? Let's see what kind of fighter you really are." Before anyone could intervene, Tank reached out to grab Jake's shoulder, a move designed to provoke a reaction that would justify escalation. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events. Jake's response was instantaneous and surgical in its precision. His left hand intercepted Tank's reaching arm, redirecting the larger man's momentum while simultaneously stepping inside his guard. In one fluid motion, Jake's right elbow connected with a specific pressure point on Tank's neck, causing the bouncer's knees to buckle involuntarily. Before Tank could recover his balance, Jake had positioned himself behind the larger man and applied a blood choke with textbook efficiency. Tank's eyes widened in panic as he realized he couldn't break free from the hold, despite his significant size and strength advantages. "Sleep," Jake whispered quietly, his voice carrying no malice or anger, just the clinical detachment of someone executing a technique he'd performed countless times before. Tank's struggles grew weaker as the choke cut off blood flow to his brain. Within seconds, the massive bouncer went limp in Jake's arms. Jake gently lowered Tank to the floor, checked his pulse to ensure he was merely unconscious, then stepped back and waited calmly for the inevitable response. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 15 seconds. Chaos erupted throughout Murphy's Tavern as 50 bikers processed what they just witnessed. Some jumped to their feet, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Others sat frozen in their chairs, recognizing the level of combat expertise they'd just observed. A few of the more experienced veterans nodded appreciatively. They understood exactly what had happened and why. "Nobody move," Steele's voice cut through the confusion like a whip crack. The authority in his tone immediately froze everyone in place. At 68, Steele commanded respect that transcended age or physical capability. "Tank's fine. He'll wake up in a few minutes with nothing worse than a bruised ego." Gunner wheeled his chair closer to examine the unconscious bouncer. As a former Marine with extensive hand-to-hand combat training, he could appreciate the technical perfection of what Jake had just demonstrated. That was a textbook rear-naked choke, applied with surgical precision, released at exactly the right moment to avoid permanent damage. More than that, added Frank Diesel Morrison, a former Green Beret who'd been quietly nursing a beer at the far end of the bar. The kid neutralized a threat 3 times his size without causing unnecessary harm. That's not just technique, that's discipline. Jake knelt beside Tank and checked his breathing and pulse again, his actions those of someone genuinely concerned for his opponent's well-being. "He'll be fine. The technique targets blood flow, not airflow. He should regain consciousness in about 2 minutes." "How did you learn to fight like that?" asked Sarah Phoenix Chen, one of only 3 women in the Rolling Thunder Motorcycle Club. As a former Army medic who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Phoenix had seen enough combat to recognize real training when she witnessed it.
Close-quarters combat is a fundamental component of Ranger training, Jake explained matter-of-factly. "We spend hundreds of hours learning to neutralize threats efficiently and quietly. Size and strength become irrelevant when you understand leverage, pressure points, and timing." As predicted, Tank began stirring after about 90 seconds. His eyes fluttered open, confusion evident on his face as he tried to process what had happened. Jake immediately knelt beside him again, offering a supportive hand. "Take your time getting up," Jake advised gently. "You might feel dizzy for a few minutes. That's normal after losing consciousness." Tank accepted Jake's assistance getting to his feet, though his pride was clearly wounded more severely than his body. The massive bouncer looked around the room, seeing the faces of 50 veteran bikers staring back at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed amusement. "How?" Tank asked simply, his voice hoarse from the brief choke. "Training. Thousands of hours of repetition until these techniques become muscle memory. In combat situations, you don't have time to think, you just react based on your training." Steele approached the two men, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and growing respect. "Tank, you picked a fight with the wrong man. This young soldier just demonstrated more restraint and professionalism than you've shown all evening." Tank's face flushed red with embarrassment. He'd built his reputation on being the toughest man in Murphy's Tavern, and that reputation had just evaporated in front of everyone who mattered to him. "I was just trying to protect the integrity of Veterans Night." "No," Steele corrected firmly. "You were trying to protect your ego. There's a difference." Jake stepped forward, extending his right hand toward Tank. "No hard feelings. You were doing what you thought was right." Tank stared at the offered handshake for several seconds before accepting it. The gesture seemed to drain the last of his hostility. "I owe you an apology, and probably a beer." "Apology accepted," Jake said immediately. "But you don't owe me anything. We all make mistakes when we're trying to do the right thing." The gracious response seemed to affect Tank more than the physical demonstration had. Here was a young man who just embarrassed him in front of 50 people, yet he was offering forgiveness without conditions or gloating. Wrench stood up from his bar stool and began slow, deliberate applause. One by one, the other veteran bikers joined in until the entire room was filled with the sound of genuine appreciation. They weren't applauding the violence, they were acknowledging the combination of skill, restraint, and character they just witnessed. "Drinks are on the house," announced Mickey O'Brien, Murphy's Tavern's owner and bartender. At 72, Mickey was a Korean War veteran who'd seen his share of tough guys come and go. Anyone who can handle themselves like that while still showing respect for their opponent deserves recognition. Jake made his way to the bar, where Mickey was already pouring a beer. The crowd parted respectfully, creating a clear path. The dynamic in the room had completely transformed. What had begun as suspicion and hostility had evolved into genuine admiration. "What'll it be, son?" Mickey asked, though he was already reaching for a bottle of premium whiskey from the top shelf. "Just a beer, thanks. Coors Light if you have it." Mickey chuckled as he slid the bottle across the polished wood surface. "After what you just demonstrated, you could order anything in the house. Most guys would be celebrating with something stronger." Jake took a sip of the beer and sighed contentedly. "I don't drink hard liquor anymore. Too many memories associated with it." The simple statement carried implications that everyone in Murphy's Tavern understood. Many combat veterans struggled with alcohol as a way to cope with traumatic experiences. Jake's self-awareness and discipline in avoiding potential triggers demonstrated yet another layer of maturity that seemed incongruous with his youthful appearance. Phoenix approached the bar and ordered a whiskey neat. As she waited for Mickey to pour her drink, she studied Jake with professional interest. "You mentioned earlier that you carried pieces of your fallen brothers with you. How do you manage that weight without it destroying you?" The question was personal and potentially intrusive, but Jake seemed to appreciate the directness. "Therapy helps. The VA connected me with a counselor who specializes in survivor's guilt. But mostly I try to honor their memory by living the kind of life they would have wanted for themselves." "That's a heavy burden for someone your age," Phoenix observed. "Age doesn't matter when it comes to loss. Pain doesn't check your birth certificate before it hits you. You either learn to carry it properly, or it crushes you." Steele joined them at the bar, his expression thoughtful. "Son, I've been around military men for over 50 years and I've never met anyone quite like you. Most young soldiers with your level of training and experience carry themselves with more arrogance." Jake considered the observation carefully. "Arrogance gets people killed in combat situations. Confidence keeps you alive, but arrogance makes you careless. I learned early that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate." "Is that why you didn't escalate the situation with Tank until he forced your hand?" "Exactly. Violence should always be the last option, and when you do use it, it should be precise and proportional. Tank wasn't actually trying to hurt me. He was protecting something he valued. I respected that, even if I disagreed with his methods." The atmosphere in Murphy's Tavern had transformed completely. What began as a hostile interrogation had evolved into something resembling a military reunion. Jake found himself surrounded by veteran bikers, eager to share their own stories and hear more details about his experiences. The camaraderie was genuine, built on the foundation of shared understanding that only combat veterans could truly appreciate. Tommy Ripper Walsh, a former Navy SEAL who'd remained silent throughout the earlier confrontation, finally approached Jake at the bar. At 45, Ripper bore the scars of multiple deployments in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. His weathered hands showed the telltale marks of someone who'd spent years handling explosives and weapons in hostile environments. "Rangers and SEALs don't usually cross paths much," Ripper said, settling onto a bar stool beside Jake. "But I worked with some of your boys during a joint operation in Helmand Province back in 2020. Professional soldiers, every one of them." Jake's interest was immediately piqued. "What was the operation?" "Classified, mostly. But I can tell you it involved extracting a high-value target from a compound that was supposed to be lightly defended. Intel was wrong, as usual. What was supposed to be a quick snatch and grab turned into a 3-day siege." "Sounds familiar," Jake replied, with dark humor. "Bad intelligence seems to be a recurring theme in our recent conflicts. The Ranger team we worked with saved our asses more than once during that operation. The squad leader was a Star Sergeant named Morrison, I think. Tough as nails, never lost his cool even when everything was falling apart." Jake's beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. David Morrison? About 6'2", scar on his left cheek, always chewing gum? "That's the one. You know him?" "He was my team leader during my first deployment. Morrison taught me more about real soldiering in 6 months than I learned in 2 years of training." Jake's voice carried deep respect mixed with sadness. He didn't make it home from his 4th tour. Ripper's face darkened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Morrison was one of the good ones." The conversation was interrupted by Earl Bones Patterson, a 73-year-old Vietnam veteran who served as the unofficial historian of the Rolling Thunder Motorcycle Club. Despite his advanced age, Bones moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with permanent nerve damage from Agent Orange exposure. "Son, I've been around military men for over 50 years, and I've never met anyone quite like you. Most young soldiers with your level of training and experience carry themselves with more arrogance." Jake considered the observation carefully. Arrogance gets people killed in combat situations. Confidence keeps you alive, but arrogance makes you careless. I learned early that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. "Is that why you didn't escalate the situation with Tank until he forced your hand?" "Exactly. Violence should always be the last option. And when you do use it, it should be precise and proportional. Tank wasn't actually trying to hurt me. He was protecting something he valued. I respected that, even if I disagreed with his methods." The natural follow-up question came from Danny Wheels, a Gulf War veteran who'd lost both legs to an IED. "Do you ever regret leaving the military, Jake?" he asked, silently wheeling his chair forward. "Unfortunately, I can't stand for anybody else being in charge. Projects like this one are more fun without some soldier in front of me yelling at me to do something he's willing to do for me." Danny smiled. He found it animating. "The last time I had anything fun like that was taking my rifle apart and cleaning it. I was better off not doing that. I had my scoop and my old rod and some oil trapped, and I had the people tickling me because I had to stop and stand up again so I could enjoy the cleaning too. The training was good, but the executive branch sucked. Outside of that, I had a great time." "Yeah, I guess I did too, when I think back on it. And that's more fun than sitting there all day as a taker in a cover sky." Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment. He was beginning to realize that survival wasn't just about physical well-being, but also about finding purpose in life. "Don't underestimate honest work," interjected Frank Diesel. "I spent 15 years after my discharge working on oil rigs in North Dakota. I thought I was wasting my training, my potential. Turns out, learning to work with your hands after years of violence can be its own form of therapy."
Phoenix returned from the restroom and rejoined the group, bringing with her a perspective that none of the men could offer. As one of the few women in special operations medicine, she'd witnessed the psychological aftermath of combat from a clinical standpoint. "Jake," she said, settling into a chair that Gunnar had vacated for her, "have you considered that your engineering studies might be more meaningful than you think? Rebuilding infrastructure, creating things that improve people's lives, that's a pretty powerful way to honor fallen soldiers." "I hadn't thought about it that way," Jake admitted. "I chose engineering because it seemed practical, stable, something that couldn't be taken away by politics or budget cuts." Steele, who had been observing the conversation while nursing his third beer of the evening, suddenly stood up. "Gentlemen and lady, I think we're missing something important here." The group fell silent, waiting for Steele to continue. "This young man walked into our tavern tonight expecting nothing more than a beer and maybe some peace and quiet. Instead, he was challenged, interrogated, and ultimately forced to defend himself. Through it all, he's shown more grace, humility, and character than most people twice his age." Steele paused, looking around the room at the faces of his fellow veterans. "I propose we make this official. Jake Sullivan, on behalf of the Rolling Thunder Motorcycle Club, I'd like to extend an invitation for you to become an honorary member of our brotherhood." The offer caught Jake completely off guard. Honorary membership in veteran motorcycle clubs was rare and significant. It represented acceptance into a community that valued loyalty, honor, and shared sacrifice above all else. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but I don't own a motorcycle, never even learned to ride one." The response triggered laughter throughout the tavern, but it was good-natured rather than mocking. "Son," Wench called out from his position near the jukebox, "owning a bike is just equipment. Being a brother is about character. We can teach you to ride, but we can't teach you to be the kind of man who deserves respect. You've already proven you have that." Tank, who had been quietly cleaning glasses behind the bar since his earlier confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "Jake, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt of gratitude." Jake looked puzzled. "For what?" "For showing me what real strength looks like. I've been using my size and my position here to intimidate people for years, thinking that made me tough. But real toughness is what you showed tonight. Having the ability to hurt someone and choosing restraint instead." Tank set down the glass he'd been cleaning and extended his hand once more. "If you'll have me, I'd like to be the first to call you brother." The gesture carried enormous significance. Tank was essentially acknowledging that his entire approach to gatekeeping had been wrong, and he was asking for a chance to start over. Jake shook Tank's hand without hesitation. Everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing. Mickey O'Brien, who had been observing the evening's events with the wisdom of his 72 years, began setting up shot glasses along the bar. "If we're going to make this official, we need to do it properly." He produced a bottle of Tennessee whiskey that looked like it had been waiting for a special occasion. The label was worn, suggesting the bottle had been stored for years. "This whiskey was distilled the year I got back from Korea. I've been saving it for something important." As Mickey poured shots for everyone in the tavern, Jake raised his hand in polite protest. "I appreciate the gesture, but I mentioned earlier that I don't drink hard liquor." "One exception," Steele said gently. "This isn't about drinking, it's about ritual. You don't have to finish it, but you need to participate in the ceremony." Jake nodded his understanding and accepted the shot glass when Mickey offered it. Steele raised his glass, and 50 other veterans followed suit. "To absent friends," he said solemnly. "To absent friends," the room echoed in unison. Jake brought the glass to his lips, taking the smallest possible sip before setting it back on the bar. The gesture was enough, He'd participated in the ritual without compromising his personal boundaries. Phoenix produced a leather vest from her saddlebag, the kind worn by motorcycle club members to display patches and insignia. She handed the vest to Jake with reverence. He would have liked you, would have respected what you represent. Jake accepted the vest with obvious emotion. The weight of the leather seemed to carry the accumulated honor of everyone who had worn it before him. "I don't know what to say," Jake admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't say anything," Steele replied. "Just wear it with pride, and remember that you're not alone anymore." As Jake slipped on Marcus's leather vest, the weight of acceptance settled over him like a mantle of responsibility. The worn leather carried the scent of road dust and engine oil, mixed with something deeper, the intangible essence of brotherhood that couldn't be manufactured or purchased. Around him, 50 veteran bikers watched in respectful silence as he adjusted the vest's fit. "There's one more thing," Steele announced, reaching into his jacket pocket. He produced a patch unlike any Jake had seen before. Not the typical motorcycle club insignia, but something more personal and meaningful. The patch featured a black background with silver embroidery depicting a military cemetery complete with rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. "This is the memorial patch," Steele explained, his voice carrying ceremonial gravity. "Every member of Rolling Thunder carries one, but they're never displayed publicly. They're worn on the inside of our vests, over our hearts, as a reminder of why we ride together." Steele carefully positioned the patch on the inside left panel of Jake's vest, directly over his heart. "This represents every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who didn't make it home. When you wear this vest, you carry their memory with you." The ceremony was interrupted by the sound of motorcycle engines roaring to life outside Murphy's Tavern. Through the windows, Jake could see the parking lot illuminated with headlights as the Rolling Thunder members prepared for what appeared to be an impromptu ride. "Where's everyone going?" Jake asked, glancing at the clock behind the bar. It was nearly midnight, hardly the typical time for a group ride. Gunnar maneuvered his wheelchair closer, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Every time we induct a new member, we take a ride to the Veterans Memorial Bridge. It's about 20 miles north of here, and it's where we pay our respects to fallen brothers." "But I don't have a motorcycle," Jake reminded them. "Already handled," Wrench called out, tossing a set of keys in Jake's direction. "Mickey keeps a spare bike in the back garage for situations exactly like this. It's nothing fancy, just a reliable Harley Sportster that runs smooth and handles well for beginners." Jake caught the keys, feeling their weight in his palm. "I've never ridden a motorcycle before. Wouldn't it be safer for everyone if I just drove my truck?" The suggestion was met with good-natured protests from around the room. Tank, who had been steadily rebuilding his relationship with the group throughout the evening, stepped forward with surprising gentleness. "Jake, riding with the pack isn't about transportation. It's about trust. When 50 bikers move together on the highway, we're trusting each other with our lives. It's the closest thing to military formation most of us experience in civilian life." Phoenix nodded in agreement. "Plus, Wrench is the best motorcycle instructor in the 3 counties. He taught my teenage nephew to ride, and that kid was afraid of bicycles." Wrench beamed with pride at the endorsement. 10 minutes in the parking lot, and you'll have the basics down. The Sportster is forgiving, and we'll keep you in the middle of the formation where you're protected." Jake looked around the room at the expectant faces surrounding him. These weren't strangers anymore. They were brothers and sisters in arms who'd accepted them into their family. Refusing their invitation would be tantamount to rejecting the bond they'd offered. "All right," Jake said, pocketing the keys. "But if I crash into someone, don't say I didn't warn you." The parking lot behind Murphy's Tavern became an impromptu training ground as Wrench walked Jake through the fundamentals of motorcycle operation.
The Harley Sportster was indeed forgiving, lighter and more manageable than the massive touring bikes favored by most of the Rolling Thunder members. Clutch, shift, throttle, brake, Wrench explained patiently, as Jake familiarized himself with the controls. Same principles as driving a manual transmission car, just with your hands and feet doing different jobs. After 20 minutes of practice starts, stops, and figure eights around the parking lot, Jake had a basic competency that impressed even the skeptical observers. His military training had given him excellent balance and spatial awareness, skills that translated surprisingly well to motorcycle operation. "Natural talent," Bones observed appreciatively. "Some people fight the bike, but you're working with it." Steele mounted his massive Road King and fired up the engine, the deep rumble serving as a signal for the other members to prepare for departure. "Jake, you'll ride directly behind me and in front of Phoenix. If you get into trouble, she's a trained medic and Wrench will be monitoring from the rear."
The formation that rolled out of Murphy's Tavern parking lot was impressive in its precision and coordination. 50 motorcycles moved as a single unit, their headlights creating a river of light flowing through the darkness. Jake found himself swept along in the middle of the formation, protected and guided by riders with decades of experience. The ride to Veterans Memorial Bridge took them through winding country roads that cut through dense forests and open farmland. Despite his inexperience, Jake found the rhythm of group riding strangely comforting. The synchronized movement of the pack, the shared coordination required to navigate turns in traffic, reminded him of military operations where individual action served a larger collective purpose. Veterans Memorial Bridge stood as a testament to sacrifice and remembrance. The structure spanned a wide river valley, its steel framework illuminated by strategically placed spotlights that highlighted engraved plaques honoring fallen service members from every branch of the military. At the center of the bridge, a bronze statue depicted a soldier kneeling beside a military cemetery headstone. The Rolling Thunder formation came to a coordinated stop in the bridge's designated memorial parking area. Engines fell silent in unison, creating a sudden stillness that seemed to amplify the significance of their destination. "This bridge was built in 1995, Steele explained as the group dismounted and gathered around the central monument. It was funded entirely by donations from veteran organizations and families of fallen soldiers. Every plaque you see represents a real person who paid the ultimate price." Jake walked slowly among the memorial plaques, reading names and dates that spanned from World War II through recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some plaques included photographs of young men and women in military dress uniforms, their faces frozen in time at the moment they'd committed their lives to serving something larger than themselves. Thompson, Michael A., Staff Sergeant 75th Ranger Regiment, KIA, March 15, 2021, Operation Crimson Dawn. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he found the plaque bearing his fallen brother's name. The bronze surface reflected the bridge's lighting, making Thompson's engraved photograph seem almost alive in the darkness. "We had this installed 6 months ago," Phoenix said softly, appearing beside Jake. "Steele pulled some strings with the memorial committee to get it expedited." Jake's hand trembled as he traced Thompson's engraved name with his fingertip. "How did you know?" "We didn't initially, but after you mentioned Operation Crimson Dawn, Steele did some research. He found the casualty reports and realized that several of your fallen brothers weren't properly memorialized anywhere publicly accessible." Steele approached carrying a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. "Jake, we took the liberty of having memorial plaques created for all 7 of your fallen brothers. They're here, on this bridge, where their sacrifice will be remembered by everyone who passes this way." Jake found himself looking at an entire section of the memorial wall dedicated to Operation Crimson Dawn casualties. Rodriguez, Williams, Jefferson, Kowalski, Martinez, Henderson. All 7 names were there, engraved in bronze with their ranks, units, and dates of death. "I don't understand," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this? You didn't know them. Because you knew them, Steele replied simply. And because you're our brother now. Their memory is part of what makes you who you are, which makes them part of our family too. The gesture overwhelmed Jake completely. For months after returning from Afghanistan, he'd struggled with the feeling that his fallen brothers had been forgotten by everyone except their immediate families. The military had moved on to new missions with new soldiers, and the general public had largely lost interest in foreign conflicts that no longer dominated news cycles. Bones approached carrying a bugler's horn, its brass surface polished to mirror brightness. "Would you like us to play taps?" Jake nodded, unable to trust his voice to remain steady. As the haunting notes of taps echoed across the river valley, 50 veteran bikers stood at attention in perfect formation. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 70s, representing conflicts from Korea through Afghanistan, but in that moment, they were united by shared understanding of loss and sacrifice. Jake stood before his brother's memorial plaques, tears streaming down his face as the final notes faded into silence. When the bugle call ended, he snapped to attention and delivered a crisp military salute that he held for a full 30 seconds. Behind him, 50 veterans followed suit, their synchronized salute creating a moment of profound respect that transcended individual differences and generational gaps. "At ease," Steele commanded softly, and 50 hands dropped to their sides in unison. Tank, who had ridden along despite not owning a motorcycle by borrowing one from Mickey, approached Jake with obvious emotion. "I owe you another apology. When I challenged you earlier, I was disrespecting not just you, but the memory of every soldier who died serving this country."
Jake wiped his eyes and turned to face the assembled group. "Thank you, all of you. I never expected to find family when I walked into Murphy's Tavern tonight." "Family is what we are," Steele confirmed. "Blood doesn't make brothers. Shared values and mutual respect do. You've proven you possess both in abundance." Phoenix stepped forward carrying a small wooden box. "One more thing. This contains soil from Arlington National Cemetery, mixed with soil from the battlefield where your brothers fell. We'd like you to sprinkle some on each memorial plaque." The ritual was deeply personal and profoundly moving. As Jake sprinkled the sacred soil, he whispered private words to each fallen brother, messages of love, regret, gratitude, and promise. The Rolling Thunder members maintained respectful silence, understanding that this was Jake's moment of closure and healing. When the ceremony concluded, the group prepared for the return ride to Murphy's Tavern. Jake's motorcycle skills had improved noticeably during the initial journey, and he felt more confident navigating the formation dynamics. "How do you feel?" Phoenix asked as they prepared to mount their bikes. Jake considered the question carefully. "Lighter, somehow. Like I've been carrying something heavy for months, and you've all helped me share the weight." "That's exactly what family does," she replied with a smile. The return ride to Murphy's Tavern carried a different energy than the solemn journey to the Memorial Bridge. Jake rode with newfound confidence, his motorcycle skills improving with each mile as muscle memory began to develop. The formation maintained its protective structure around him, but he no longer felt like a burden being carried by the group. He was becoming an integral part of their coordinated movement. As they approached the outskirts of town, Phoenix's voice crackled through the communication system that connected the lead riders. "We've got company waiting at Murphy's." Steele's response was immediate and measured. "What kind of company?" "Looks like local law enforcement, 3 patrol cars and what appears to be a sheriff's vehicle." Jake's stomach tightened with concern. His earlier confrontation with Tank had been witnessed by 50 people. And while the bouncer had clearly initiated the conflict, Jake's response had been decisive and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. "Pull into the side lot," Steele commanded through the radio. "Let's assess the situation before we approach the main entrance." The Rolling Thunder formation smoothly diverted to a secondary parking area that provided a clear view of Murphy's Tavern's front entrance. 4 police vehicles were indeed waiting, their red and blue lights creating an ominous light show against the tavern's weathered exterior. Sheriff Margaret Maggie Crawford emerged from the lead vehicle as the motorcycles came to a stop. At 58, Sheriff Crawford commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Her reputation for fairness and professionalism had earned her 3 consecutive election victories in a county where law enforcement was taken seriously. "Evening, Steele," Sheriff Crawford called out, her tone suggesting familiarity rather than hostility. "Heard you folks had some excitement tonight." Steele dismounted his Road King and approached the sheriff with the easy confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. "Evening, Maggie. What brings you out here so late?" Received a call about an assault at Murphy's Tavern. Someone reported that a young man attacked Tommy Morrison unprovoked. The witness claimed the attacker used some kind of martial arts to choke Tommy unconscious. Jake felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes as the veteran bikers processed this information. He'd expected potential legal consequences from his confrontation with Tank, but the description of events was clearly distorted. "Who made the report?" Steele asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Anonymous tip called in about 30 minutes ago. Caller claimed to be a concerned patron who witnessed the assault." Tank stepped forward from the group, still wearing the borrowed motorcycle gear that made him look surprisingly small compared to his usual imposing presence behind the bar. "Sheriff Crawford, I need to clarify something important." Sheriff Crawford's attention shifted to Tank, her expression showing recognition. "Tommy, you're the alleged victim in this report. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am, I'm fine. But I need to set the record straight about what happened tonight." Tank's voice carried a seriousness that commanded attention from everyone present. "I'm listening." Tank glanced at Jake, then back to the sheriff. "The incident report you received is completely false. I was the aggressor in tonight's confrontation. I challenged Jake Sullivan here, questioned his military service, and ultimately put my hands on him first."
Sheriff Crawford pulled out a notepad, her professional demeanor indicating she was taking Tank's statement seriously. "Continue." "Jake defended himself with minimal force necessary to neutralize the threat I posed. He could have hurt me seriously, but instead, he used a restraint technique that rendered me unconscious briefly without causing injury. When I regained consciousness, he immediately checked on my welfare and offered assistance." "This contradicts the report I received," Sheriff Crawford noted. "The caller claimed the young man attacked you without provocation." Steele stepped closer to the conversation. "Maggie, we have 50 witnesses who can verify Tank's account. The entire Rolling Thunder Motorcycle Club was present for the incident." Sheriff Crawford surveyed the assembled bikers, recognizing many faces from years of professional interaction. The Rolling Thunder Club had an exemplary reputation in the county. They regularly participated in charity rides, memorial services, and community events. Their word carried significant weight. "Tommy, why would someone file a false report about this incident?" Tank's face flushed with embarrassment. "There were a few younger guys at the bar tonight who didn't appreciate seeing me get shown up by someone half my size. I think one of them called it in hoping to cause trouble for Jake." Jake finally spoke up, his voice steady despite the stress of the situation. "Sheriff, I understand this looks problematic. I'm willing to cooperate fully with any investigation." Sheriff Crawford studied Jake carefully, noting his respectful demeanor and the obvious support he enjoyed from the veteran community. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have any military training that would explain your ability to subdue someone of Tommy's size?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm a former Army Ranger with extensive close-quarters combat training. I served 3 deployments in Afghanistan between 2019 and 2022. "And tonight's incident?" "Tank challenged my military service and ultimately grabbed my shoulder in what I perceived as an aggressive manner. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm." Sheriff Crawford closed her notepad and looked around at the assembled group. 50 witnesses, all veterans, all corroborating the same story.
The alleged victim admits he was the aggressor and praises his attacker's restraint. Mr. Sullivan cooperating fully and showing clear remorse for the necessity of using force. She paused, making a decision that would affect everyone present. I'm closing this complaint as unfounded. No crime was committed here tonight. If anything, Mr. Sullivan showed commendable restraint in a difficult situation. A collective sigh of relief passed through the group, but Sheriff Crawford wasn't finished. However, I want to address something else. Mr. Sullivan, your military record shows multiple deployments and significant combat experience. How are you adjusting to civilian life? The question caught Jake off guard with its personal nature. It's been challenging, ma'am, but tonight I found something I didn't expect, a community that understands what I've been through. Sheriff Crawford nodded approvingly. The Rolling Thunder Club has helped more veterans than most people realize. Steele, I assume you're extending membership to Mr. Sullivan. Already done. Jake's one of us now. Good. Mr. Sullivan, this county takes care of its veterans. If you decide to stay in the area, there are resources available, job placement assistance, counseling services, housing programs. My office works closely with the VA to ensure our military families get the support they've earned. Jake felt another wave of unexpected emotion. In the span of a single evening, he'd gone from being a lonely stranger passing through town to being embraced by an entire community. Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate that more than you know. Sheriff Crawford prepared to return to her vehicle, but paused for one final comment. Tommy, I've known you for 15 years, and tonight might be the first time I've seen you show genuine humility. Whatever happened in that tavern, it seems to have been good for your character. Tommy nodded gratefully. It was, ma'am. Jake taught me some important lessons about what real strength looks like. As the police vehicles departed, the Rolling Thunder members began dismounting their motorcycles and preparing to return to Murphy's Tavern. The evening's events had created bonds that would last lifetimes, but there was still unfinished business to address. Mickey O'Brien appeared in the tavern's doorway, having waited patiently for the legal situation to resolve. Everything sorted out? All good, Mickey. How about one last round before we call it a night? The group filed back into Murphy's Tavern, their mood noticeably lighter after Sheriff Crawford's visit. Jake found himself at the center of attention once again, but this time, the focus was celebratory rather than challenging.
Speech! Gunner called out, raising his beer bottle. The newest member of Rolling Thunder needs to say something. Jake looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the course of a few hours. These men and women had challenged him, tested him, accepted him, and ultimately defended him. They represented something he'd thought was lost forever, the brotherhood he'd known in military service. I came to Murphy's Tavern tonight looking for a beer and some solitude, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Instead, I found something I didn't even know I was missing: family. He paused, collecting his thoughts. 6 hours ago, I was Jake Sullivan, former Army Ranger, struggling to find my place in a civilian world that doesn't understand what we've been through. Now I'm Jake Sullivan, member of Rolling Thunder, brother to 50 of the finest people I've ever met. Applause began building throughout the tavern. You've given me something invaluable tonight. Proof that the brotherhood we knew in service doesn't have to end when we hang up our uniforms. You've shown me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who have your back when everything goes wrong. Jake raised his beer bottle. To Rolling Thunder, the family I never knew I needed, but will never take for granted. 50 voices echoed his toast, and 50 bottles clinked together in celebration of bonds forged through shared understanding, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. As the evening wound down and members began departing for home, Jake found himself standing outside Murphy's Tavern with Steele, looking up at stars visible despite the town's modest light pollution. Any regrets about tonight? Steele asked. Jake considered the question carefully. About defending myself against Tank? No.
About finding this family? Definitely not. About that anonymous caller who tried to cause trouble? I actually feel sorry for them. Why's that? Because they'll never understand what we have here. They'll never know what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. Steele clapped Jake on the shoulder. Welcome home, brother. As Jake rode the borrowed Sportster back to his motel room, wearing Marcus's leather vest and carrying the weight of new brotherhood, he realized that everything had changed. Tomorrow, he would call his landlord back in Denver and cancel his lease. He would contact the construction company and request a transfer to their local office. He would enroll in engineering classes at the community college. For the first time since leaving the Army, Jake Sullivan had found where he belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.